Welcome, test takers. Welcome to the Geek and the Guru podcast. This is Brian Lee, the test geek. Beside me is the guru, the incomparable Dean Tinney. How are you doing today, Dean?
I'm doing fantastic.
Excellent, excellent. We're here to take a look at the Series 65 exam. This is episode 1 of a 5-episode podcast. We'll start off very broadly. Who takes the Series 65, Dean?
Well, I think there is quite a few people who categories of test takers. We have our traditional 6 people with a 663. Sometimes I'll ask them, what is their next testing victory, if any? Because they might just be doing 663. But if they want to be a part of the affiliated investment advisory firm and get some fees, they got to take a 65. We might have some legacy, I call them legacy, lack of better term. People who had a 763 and were agents with the broker dealer, have been doing that for years. And again, they too now want to participate with the affiliated investment advisory firm and get fees. And then we have some folks that, God bless them, are tabula rasas, blank slates. The first and only test taking victory they're seeking is a 65. To be a fee-based investment advisor representative for one of those firms. So I think those would be the 3 groups. 663. I would also say there are legacy producers that both have 663 and 763. So I don't know if I call that a separate category, but I think it is. People who are in production and now are facing.
I think they are, because I believe that they're coming from different types of financial institutions. The 6 and 63 generally are a little bit more insurance based, where the Series 7 obviously and 63 are more brokerage based. I think, Dean, I probably see the first category predominantly. The Series 6 and 63, they're primarily insurance based. And it also kind of defines the challenge that they, as well as we, the intermediaries, have in trying to pass the Series 65. They're trying to wedge this exam into typically a full working day. They already have a book of business. They're servicing that book of business, and then they try to wedge the Series 65. And it's a challenge. And the 65 itself, as you know, I usually tell people it's like a combined Series 7 and 63 together. What do you think?
I do. I sometimes find myself more and more referring to it as a baby 7.
That's right.
And I think it's even more challenging because there's not as much of a narrative thread to it as the Series 7. I mean, Series 7 has a kind of a logic to, finding a customer, opening an account, making an investment, what happens next. And the 65 can be all over the place in terms of, I calls it 2Zs and 3Zs here, and
right.
And so I think it's more of a challenge. I think it can be more of a challenge than even the 7 for a lot of folks.
I agree. As a matter of fact, I once heard, I have no idea if this is true. I don't even know if I'll get in trouble for saying this, but I once heard the regulators of the 65, right? NASAA, the North American Securities Administrators Association. I, at a conference, once told their attendees that they have a lower pass rate than the FINRA exams. And again, I have no idea if that's true. I don't know if I'm telling tales out of school, but it is a challenging exam. There's no doubt about it.
It wouldn't surprise me, Brian, because along a parallel kind of a thing, almost every time FINRA wants to do something to make things easier or more liberal, it's always NASA that is, spoiling the party, so to speak.
That's
Whether that be the new continuing ed requirements or whatever, FINRA puts something up and then NASA comes back and says, so wouldn't surprise me at all.
Exactly. I guess they're both swimming at the same pool, I guess, or trying to, etch out their own territories.
I would say most of them do. You got to keep in the back of the mind that a lot of them are not investment practitioners. A lot of them are attorneys. And they speak legalese and they write questions in legalese. Right.
And as a matter of fact, when you talk to these legacy folks, the folks who either have the 6 and 63 or the 7 and 63, they talk about oftentimes that when they took those exams years and years ago, and then they come up against the 65, it doesn't look the same. It doesn't feel the same. I oftentimes tell people that, because NASA tend more towards the legal aspects, they're more attorneys, lawyers, those sorts of things, rather than the investment professionals, that the syntax of the test questions and or the answer choices seem different than the FINRA exams. And that brings us to our next stop, perfect segue, if I may say, who essentially passes and who doesn't pass the 65. What do you think, Dean?
Well, I think, like we say, it could be a challenge, and I don't doubt that NASA prides themselves on having a lower pass rate. Whether it's by design or not, who knows? But I think one of the difficult things for a lot of folks is people. We talk about these legacy, current producers who have, for many years had a 663, making a good living, doing commissions on the securities and making commissions on the insurance products. And because they're in production, two things, and successful sales people, communicators, I think a lot of times, I don't want to call it hubris, but I think they don't need as much time as they do. And it's harder for them to carve that time out.
That's exactly right.
I think those, are the most challenging, and that they don't respond well to not passing. But I mean, it is what it is. And I get aggravated, Brian, with, I told you, they're men and women I love, but I had one of them tell me they were committed to me to give me an hour a day of study time. And, they said, yeah, Dean, I did 15 minutes on the subway, 20 minutes at lunch, and I did 30 minutes on the bus back. I go, that doesn't work. So I think those people are at risk. I think the tabula rasas, or the other party I think is a risk, are the people who, their buddy says, hey, join me in my investment advisory firm. They have zero background in security. So, there are at least some people who are coming to this fresher. And, to be honest with you, the people who have a 663, just past that and go on 65, have an easier go of it, I think. I mean, they still are challenged, but I think some of this stuff they've already encountered on their 63, for example, if it was 2 weeks ago, or their 6, if it as it relates to mutual funds. So I think they probably have the easiest they're all challenged, but I think they have the easiest go.
I agree 100%. The biggest challenge, and like I said, the biggest group that I work with was that first group, the folks who are 663, they're predominantly insurance. So they got, if you don't mind me saying, kind of two strikes against them. One, they don't have a strong investment background. And two, they're servicing that book of business, and that means going out and seeing people and having appointments, and it's hard for them to carve out a certain period of time. And one of the first things I advise these folks to do, you must carve out time every single day. The last thing you want to do is stretch this thing out for 6 months. You do a couple of days here, you do a couple of days. Oh, I got a conference in Boise, Idaho, or Cincinnati, and I'll come back to it. I said, nope, it's not going to work. You need to block out. And I think I heard you mention several times where you tell these folks to block out a certain period of time.
Yeah,
every single day.
I call them study blocks. And
that's right.
There's two reasons to have study blocks. I agree with you, Brian, too. It's kind of, I always joke, it's kind of like an athletic event in this regard. You need a rhythm, and you can't establish a 65 rhythm by an hour, Monday, and then, something comes up and now it's Thursday, you do another hour. There's two problems with that. One's the rhythm. And then the second part, Brian, if they make it take 6 months, and God knows, I know some of them do, or 8 months, this keeps him moving. You can very easily in the 6 month forget what you learned in the first month.
That's exactly.
So I am proud to say, as an intermediary, that we are, I don't know if you'll agree with this, we embrace the idea of cramming in a smart way, cramming these hours into a certain time frame with a start and a finish. And we don't think it should be 6 months.
Exactly. And again, a perfect segue into our next section, how to best study and pass the Series 65. And again, I think we just kind of alluded to the fact that one is a regular rhythm, discipline, resiliency, and get that time period down, saying, okay, I'm going to have these study blocks. I'm going to do this. As a matter of fact, I wrote a blog several years ago on what I thought was the best study plan to help pass any of the exams. Really, it's the same process no matter what the exam. Because we all start with those, oh my goodness, the 600-page textbooks. In most of my introductions to my video course, I always go through the story about how when I first got hired, the boss says, welcome to the team, here, read this. And that's all I had. And I just plowed through that thing cover to cover. It was 600 pages. Now, how much are you going to retain from 600 pages? So obviously I had to go through it multiple times. With the tools available today, however, we can still plow through that textbook, which I wholeheartedly recommend that you get through that textbook, all 600 pages of it, but do it in a systematic way where you can help retain some of that information. As a matter of fact, in the blog, I mentioned just taking the textbook by unit, doing several practice questions after each unit, and then building those practice questions after successive units. So after unit 3, you're not only doing a few questions on unit 3, but you're going to do several questions on units 1 through 3. So you're obtaining and retaining and reinforcing the prior material. And using the study blocks that you mentioned, especially for these folks who are, servicing a book of business, whether that's an hour, 90 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever they set that study block to be, they can spend some of that time reading and some of the time doing practice questions rather than just sitting there for an hour and a half and reading that god-awful textbook. Break it up a little bit, right? But the most important thing that textbook does for us is to lay the base, lay a foundation, even though the 600 pages, I'm going to tell you right now, is above and beyond where the test is going to go. What do you think, Dean?
I agree with you. And, those books also get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, particularly on the 65. I mean, the 65, One Test Prep vendor just came out with the 12th edition, even though there has been no change since the first edition in test content. And is everything in there testable? Well, I think that they do get carried away. So neither one of us are saying don't read the book. You should read the book cover to cover.
Absolutely.
But that being said, then, that's your first kind of, as Brian calls them, his 3 pillars of building the base. And that's part of building that base. I think once you're done reading the book, then I would use it primarily as a reference tool.
Absolutely.
So if you need to go to the table of contents or to the index, that's the way to then use that as a reference tool. I think every test taker should buy paid study materials that would, as a minimum, include a manual, a book, and a Q bank. That would be the minimum for entry into consideration. And then, as we said, part of our, our Geek and Guru podcast is then, once you get that done, maybe you want to consider somebody who can make your life easier as an intermediary to help you get past that.
Well, that's exactly what we do, isn't it? And that's my second pillar. Once you get through that textbook, once you cover a significant number of the practice questions, right? And we said a lot of that information is above and beyond where the test will go. The theory being is better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. But because the textbooks are getting so large, and like you absolutely said, Dean, they always seem to get longer, never shorter. And the tests haven't essentially changed in 30 years. So what you need to do is to have an intermediary. This is my second pillar, right? And that's exactly what Dean and I do. We try to take that tremendous amount of information and concentrate on the most likely testable concepts that almost everybody gets to see. There's a core content that everybody gets to see. So what I oftentimes tell people is what's on the test, how it most likely shows up on the test, and how you should answer it. Because I think including test taking tips, how to read and answer test questions is important as well. So in effect, what we're doing is taking that tremendous amount of material and concentrating on it to the testable material. What I like to say is taking mashed potatoes and making premium vodka. That's what we like to do.
Brian, I always tell people the analogy where I think paid supplements, particularly on 65, are so important.
Exactly.
Is because of the text and the things we're talking about, you can really get into the weeds. And I really feel like sometimes we're mounting rescue operations, and thank God they found us as intermediaries, as bridges, because they could really go down some, I call it, you want to stay on the broad avenues and highways, and they're in some 65 cul-de-sac somewhere based on test prep vendors. I always think of it as kind of like I'm a bus driver. My job is to get you to the stadium. It's your job to find your seat. So I'd say, here you are. I'm dropping you at the game, the 65. Now you got to go find your seat. Now, I feel bad sometimes, Brian, because without that second pillar supplement, I feel like they're not even at the ballpark. I'm like, hey, 65, it's over here.
That's right. That's exactly right. And again, if we concentrate on the most, because there's a core content, especially with the NASA exams, the 65, the laws and regs. And that's another thing too, as the way, as much as those textbooks vary from one another. There are some textbooks, you talk about the rabbit holes. I call it Alice's rabbit hole, right? They take you down to these paths that, and they're trying to attain all of this information. And oftentimes when they go above and beyond into these rabbit holes, it's sometimes pushing out the good stuff, the stuff that we absolutely need to know. So that's true, where our supplements, your unpaid free
I
supplements.
think particularly on math, for example.
Yep.
There's lots of test prep vendors on 65 who go way overboard. We're not saying it's there. Brian's right. There are certain things that are high probability that everybody will encounter on their 65. There are other things that are lower probability. But one of the areas, Brian, where I think they can go down what you're calling Alice's rabbit hole, I say a mental cul-de-sac, is some of these test prep vendors who, people can misinterpret the level and complexity of the math they're going to have to do. They're not going to have to do much of it, and it's nowhere near as complex as some of the test prep vendors make it.
Absolutely. Oftentimes, and again, there's some differences in opinions for a lot of these things. I know math is not really a big emphasis on any of the exam. I think the emphasis should be on the concept that the math is trying to describe, because there's so many people out there that have so much math anxiety to begin with, right? So let's not concentrate on your anxieties. Let's kind of concentrate on your strengths. Well, how about, can you give me a list of formulas? Well, I don't really kind of like doing that, because then you don't get the context around that math. The bond yields, the tax equivalent stuff, where does that stuff fit in? If you just have a list of it, you might not get all of that. Yeah. So, that's what we are here to do. We're driving you to the arena. I love it. That's a great analogy. I love it. The third pillar, once we get that concentration, once we turn those mashed potatoes into premium vodka, now it's time to evaluate. Let's see where you are, right? So I usually put out a little timeline, 7 to 10 days out from your test date. If you're more comfortable with 2 weeks out, whatever. Okay. That's when we have to evaluate. Where are we? That means it's time to take a simulated exam. Let's do a 130 question exam that mirrors, the best the law allows, what the real test is going to look like, smell like, and feel like, right? That way we'll have a baseline. Okay. Are you scoring 65, 68, 78? Where is that? And what's really nice today, unlike when you and I first got into business, these platforms, these practice question platforms are so nice. Some nicer than others, but some are so nice that once you take that practice exam, you can then do a performance tracker where they take that score, break it down into the different components. It's amazing, so that you can find your weak areas. What do you think?
Well, I think there's two things, and I think this is one of the areas where there's a little, you've got to be careful you don't have too many voices in your head. So, Brian and I think disagree a little bit on how many practice questions are necessary. Don't confuse practice questions with practice finals. I think we're in agreement in what we're talking about now in terms of practice finals. I think I have a little bit of a baggage from being an accountability partner and being able to see those trackers as somebody who's your big brother, for lack of a better word, who's trying to shepherd you through the process. Let's put it that way. And what I can do is punch up that Q bank and look at your performance tracker, see how many practice questions you've been doing, and it's a tangible way to keep track of where you're at in the process. So
Absolutely.
I think you should do more of that. But if you there's lots of those questions that again are kind of like the textbook and practice questions. There's some what I call gotcha questions. Like we're talking about the math, for example. I would tell you that any practice question that needs 3 paragraphs to tell you why you were wrong and what the right answer is probably a poor question to
Probably.
begin with. So, there's some in there that are not productive. Now, as it relates to final tests, we are not recommending that you are trying to learn by missing practice questions. I think one piece of bad advice people get is just do all the practice tests, do all the practice questions, and then go test. And I think that's terrible. We're talking about doing a practice final or practice exam to get a mark of where you're at. I call it an intellectual inventory.
Exactly.
Let's see where you're at, get the mark. And I always tell people the first one
Yes.
is not important. That's just the mark. Now I know we're probably you probably have timing. I think you said 7 days out. I think another big foible, I'll call it a foible, is people wait too long to get that mark.
Right.
Because what happens is the timeline in your study plan starts collapsing on you.
Yeah.
And if you find out you're testing Friday and you found out Wednesday you got some holes, it's going to be hard to plug them. So I would say you should definitely, I'm with Brian, that first one should be 10 days out, get that first mark, see where you're at, and you want to get, reevaluate that. Now, I know Brian and I might disagree about how many practice tests. I mean, what do you think? How many are you looking for, Brian?
Well, see, that's it. We get that question a lot, don't we? How many practice finals should I take? Like, there's a magic number out there. And I believe you and I both agree with this. There really isn't a magic number. And again, it depends on which test, but to 65 specifically, what we want to do, we want to take that first practice final, exactly take that intellectual inventory, and get a baseline. Where are we? The performance tracker will then identify which content areas you are the weakest in. My goodness, I would have given my left arm to have that kind of information when I was taking my tests back in the day. So you take the practice final, take that inventory, find your weak areas. The following day, you work on the weak areas. You use, my video course, you use Dean's videos, YouTube videos. You use the textbook as a reference guide, the index, the glossary, the particular unit. So that's what you do on that second day to help ramp up.
Can I add just one thing, Brian?
Yeah.
I would get fired if I worked at the testing center. And here's why. I would say, well, what do you know this morning, Brian? Well, I'm going to find out. And I would say, that's terrible, Brian. You should know before you got here what you know or don't know.
That's exactly right.
You shouldn't go down to the 65 with the idea that that's when you're going to find out what your weak areas are, what your strong areas are. So, I call that the remediation. So what Brian is saying is you can't stack practice final upon practice final. You got to give yourself time to do the practice final, get the mark, and then take remedial action.
It's evaluation, remediation. That's exactly right. I mean, that last week, right? Now the pressure's starting to come on, and you're starting to feel the nerves a little bit. But hey, I got a 72 on my practice final yesterday. I have 3 areas I need to work on today.
Yeah,
I'm going to work on these 3 areas to get those up. I then take the next evaluation. Hey, I got a 75. Oh. And I've got these 3 areas. 2 of them were still the same as the other day, but I'll work again on those. So you've got that 7 to 10 days for evaluation and, more importantly, that remediation. You're exactly right. Going into that test, you probably have an idea of where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are. And remember, it's a net game. That means you need 72% or better. I don't care where it comes from.
I wish, Brian, once you got across that market, would just shut down and say thank you very much.
I know.
Listen, I got to sing some praises here. This is an informational podcast. We're not doing a commercial. That being said, though, I had somebody testing on a Monday. They took the Test Geek 65 practice test because I know that's a good correlation. And, as we said, we wanted to have time for remediation. And he got a 67. I said, well, my friend, had that been the real test, you would have failed. Good news. This is not Monday. It is Friday. And good news, we have 2 days for more remediation. I'm
Right.
certain if you stay dedicated, disciplined, and organized, we're going to find you those few points. Now, the problem is, had he done that on a Sunday,
Too late.
well, we don't know, right? And you
Yeah,
and I, Brian, know that we have a pretty good idea when we're working with people and helping them with tutoring, whether we think they're going to pass or not. They
exactly.
surprise us pleasantly sometimes,
That's right. That's right.
unpleasantly sometimes. But I totally agree with you that you want to at least do one. If you're testing on a Monday, Friday, Saturday, that should be the last one, and make it good correlation. I would hope if you have
That's
a
right.
test
Yeah.
prep vendor that has good correlation.
To reinforce what you just said, I got an email last week that says, "Hey, I'm taking my test on Tuesday. Can you give me a call on Monday, the day before my test?" I said, "Nah, I don't think there's not much I can do for you on Monday. I don't know where your weak
If
areas
we
are."
could, we could charge a lot of money. I joke if we had some magic pill or something. Oh yeah, call us Monday. You pass Tuesday.
That's right.
We would be charging
And
a lot more for our services.
that's exactly right. And then I just got an email today, not just today, saying, "Brian, I took my first practice final. I got this score. These are my weak areas. I'm going to take another one on Wednesday. And then I'm going to take another one on Friday after doing some remedial work." I said, "Well, based on your scores so far, right, it looks like you got a really good chance of passing this thing. I would even guess greater than a 90% chance based on these scores. And if you keep doing the remediation, that chance of passing is just going to go up." And
I
so
wish,
he was
Brian,
doing,
that
and he said, "Well, my test date's not till the 15th or
oh,
whatever,
yeah,
it was 10 days out." I said, "Perfect. You're doing the right
right.
thing. You're doing it the right way. You keep at it and you should be very successful."
You're on stay the course, as I always say.
That's exactly right.
Good news, he had
Exactly.
Brian. If it's not Brian, I would or myself as a accountability partner, use your study group or use your cohort you're training with, or even a good friend. Just to even if it's not somebody can help you in addressing your remediational efforts and to test content. Just having somebody that you would articulate that to, whether that's your significant other. I'm going to just what that person said to Brian. Hey, baby, whoever it is, I'm going to be taking my this on Monday. I'm going to do this on Tuesday, and
Yep.
have somebody that can check in with you and say, hey, I thought you told me you're going to be doing this Wednesday. What's up? So you try and get some support around you in terms of when you're executing that study plan.
Oh boy, especially with as much time as this thing you have to invest in this thing, having some good support behind you sure does help. Just to kind of review just a bit, the 3-pillar process we were discussing, it was lay that base with that textbook, right? As much fun as that can be, and all 600 pages of it. Again, chop it up, do some practice, do some reinforcement, right? Have the discipline with those study blocks and some diversity in those study blocks. Read a little bit, do some practice questions, read a little bit, do some practice questions every single day. You map out that plan. That discipline is really important, right? To lay that base and foundation. Then, if you are so enjoying to get a intermediary such as Dean or myself, we think that would be very helpful in turning mashed potatoes. That's my favorite saying nowadays, Dean. Turning mashed potatoes into premium vodka. Just love that, right? Where we can concentrate on what shows up, how it most likely shows up, and how you should answer it. That's the second pillar, right? To concentrate and distill that information. And then thirdly, evaluate and remediate. Evaluate and remediate. Those, I think, is just the recipe for success. The discipline, the resilience, the time management, especially for those of you, right, who are servicing those books of business, and you're working and you got family obligations and all the other outside obligations that you might have. You need a good study plan. So that brings us to our third and last part of this. There is a related exam, the Series 66, and one of the most common emails I have gotten over the years is, which one should I take? The Series 65 or the Series 66? Dean, what do you think?
I think that once you're in the registration mode, I've always been a big believer you should go for full registration rather than limited registration. So if there are registrations that allow you to do more and you only have to take one that can do what two can do, I'm a big fan of that. For some reason, some firms, their employees think there's a difference between the cohort that is going to be 763 and only agents of the broker dealer, and then the cohort that are 766s and going to be agents of the broker dealer and investment advisor reps of the affiliated investment advisory firm. I think in an ideal world, I would recommend the 66. There's 30 less performance opportunities. You've taken your seven, so some of it will be familiar. There's some difference. It's a different test, but there's some similarities to it. And then I sometimes, for some folks, some people really struggle on the 66. I sometimes recommend the 63, 65 is perhaps a fallback position if you, for some reason, don't get the 66. And the thing I always want to remind people is the 66 isn't available for that group of people we talked about who have 663s. So that's not there. This is only an option for somebody who's got a 7.
That's
and
right.
Now they have a choice between the 63, 65 or 66. Given they have that choice, I recommend the 66. What about you, Brian?
That's right. It is absolutely a question generally only for those who have a Series 7, because the 7 is a prerequisite or a co-requisite of the 66. So it's usually a question from that second group of people that you were talking about earlier, Dean, the people who had gotten a 7 and 63 several years ago.
Do you still recommend the 66 in that circumstance?
Well, see, that's the difficult question. I personally like the 66.
Me too.
Just like you said, it's only 100 questions. The 65 was designed for someone who does not have a Series 7, so it has far more economics, far more investment vehicles than the 66. The 66, I believe, along with the laws and regs, has a lot of portfolio construction, portfolio management type issues that they may not be familiar with, but I don't think it's difficult content. When you start getting into discounted cash flows and those sorts of things. After the Series 7, the Series 66 is my favorite exam.
Yeah,
so
really?
I
Wow.
love the 66.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Wow.
That's why they call me the geek, right?
Right. Yeah. I don't know if you know this historically, Brian, but the 66 came after the 63, 65 because people
Yes,
were so aggravated that they were taking an exam that looked like the 63 and the 7. And so then NASA rolled out the 66. So, I do think it's the better choice if you have it, right? If that choice is available to you. And I even say be aggressive with your firm. The most firms, even if they tell you no, are going to appreciate you pushing to take a 66. So if there's a chance you can take a 66, I'd push for it if you are in that circumstance.
And I think too that with this choice for Series 7, folks, you basically have 2 arrows in your quiver, don't you?
I totally agree. That's the other reason.
I think I heard you once use that analogy.
I do. I'd say it's another arrow in your quiver. And, I had a young lady who, we've talked about people who don't pass the 65 or 66, but in her case, this is back in the days they gave scores. She got a awesome score on the 7. Nobody thought she was at risk on 66. Nobody, including me. For whatever reason, she missed the mark. Now, at her firm, it was a career-threatening thing. And I reached out to the manager. I said, listen, you and I both know she's a smart lady. Why don't we let her take a 63, 65 and get her back on track? And she was able to make that little retrograde movement and back in business. So that's what I like, having that extra arrow in your quiver, so to speak, right? You got 3 shots at listen, Brian, we were talking about these people who are producing people. One thing I do like about them is they are very resilient. Yeah. And I have one of them who's a top producer. There's no way she's not losing her job if she doesn't pass, because they're not getting her one of their top producers. And I love how much self-esteem. She didn't get any of it wrapped up in not passing the exam. Do we want you to pass the first time? We most certainly do.
Absolutely.
But oh my goodness, she was shooting every arrow in her quiver. So she did the 6, 63, 65, and then I said, well, no, the 66 won't work. And then she said, well, it would work if I had a 7. I'll go try to take the 7 3 times, and then I'll have 3 shots at the 66. I'm like, oh my God. Finally, she got it done. God bless her, right?
My goodness gracious. Yeah, it as a matter of fact, I think I wrote a blog several years ago on, the 65 versus 66. And I personally, and again, it's a personal decision, really. I like the 66. I don't know why. I just do. I guess, the first start was it because it's only 100 questions as opposed to 130,
Uh,
right? And I know I have that 63, 65 option behind me.
right.
Having, it's like a little life preserver back there in case I need it, that kind of thing. I like the content a little bit better.
A little cleaner, a little
I,
cleaner.
I don't want to talk about preferred stock and how much, how bond like it is,
Right.
which is on the 65, right? Because it's got far
Yeah,
more.
yeah. It's fixed income investment vehicles, certainly. Yeah.
That's right. So, I'm just a bigger fan of the 66.
That's that. Yeah. I guess I'm growing to love the NASAA exams a weird way. I have never been a big fan of the NASAA exams for all the reasons we've discussed. Remember, the North American Security Administrators Association, as we've said, is our regulators. I always joke, Brian, the SEC is God, and state administrators think they are. So, there's these 50 demigods running around, and they're the ones requiring you to take this test. But, when we can help people, I guess
Yeah.
where I'm starting to like it a little more is when we help people with their SIE or their 7, that feels good. 24s, 9s, and 10s, it feels good. But when we can help people with a 65 or 66, more so on the 65, by the way,
That's
that just makes
exactly
me
right.
go, woo! That's a
Dean,
victory for our test takers, and I think it's a victory for us as well.
I got to tell you a little secret.
Uh,
The 65 and 66 and the 63 to some degree was what inspired me to create Test Geek Exam Prep
really?
LLC. It was because it was not only a challenge for people to take, but it was a challenge to teach. If you recall, we had to teach that Series 63 in an afternoon, trying to explain the difference between federal IAs and state IAs and broker dealers and agents in like 3.5 hours. So I found a way in which I could organize that information, take 65 pages of text and put it down to one, right? Again, making premium vodka out of mashed potatoes.
Yeah, your cheat sheet is wonderful.
But that's what made me start Test Geek Exam Prep.
That's
I
crazy.
created some supplements for these NASAA exams.
Man, I'm learning on our podcast. I'm also learning some things about fun facts about the test.
Exactly. Well, that should do it for our first episode for the Series 65. I had fun, Dean. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Our next episode, we'll start getting into the content, and the largest content being, and everybody's favorite content, the laws and regs. So please stay tuned for our second episode of the Geek and the Guru podcast. Dean, thanks again. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day. Take care now. Bye-bye.